Hi everyone, I'm Sidney McKinnon, MD and CIO of Cadiz Asset Management. And today I thought I'd talk to you about something on our series of all things fixed income that is very relevant on our economic calendar. After two failed attempts at delivering the country's national budget, the Minister of Finance eventually delivered a budget on the 21st of May 2025. This was the third attempt. And I think eventually the Government of National Unity agreed on key issues in order for this budget to be tabled before Parliament. Key issues such as government spending, as well as key issues on a commitment to implement structural reforms. Now, how was this depicted in this latest budget? I think the first thing is that the players involved realized that they need to look at growth critically and understand that their forecast of growth was maybe a bit optimistic. So what they did was they tempered their forecast of growth within the country as well as their inflation forecast. But of course, by tempering growth in the forecast, you're also intimating that your economy will maybe not grow as much as you first thought it would. But having said that, I think there's also was a sincere commitment to look at the changes in the composition of spending. Now, this is quite important because a budget is made up of two parts. The first part is your revenue, in other words, what's come in, and the second part is your liability section or your expenditure. Let's rather say your expenditure section. And I think in previous attempts with the budget, not all parties could agree on the way in which the expenditure was going to happen. Now, an important factor from a change in the first budgets that were tabled to the one that was eventually tabled on the 21st of May is that this budget does not contain any VAT increases. Now, I think the first two budgets had VAT increases in them, and this was a very contentious point within the budget. Obviously, with them taking out the VAT increase, it created a hole within the budget in terms of how that revenue that was going to be collected as a result of an increased VAT proposal was going to be filled. This time around, there was a compromise or a change in the composition in the way in which things are going to be spent, which obviously mitigates the amount of deficit that was created by not having a VAT increase. So there definitely was also a move in this budget to, instead of doing a lot of current spending, was to move towards infrastructure spending. Now, definitely that also goes hand in hand with changes that had to be made, especially in reforming the way in which actually issues such as the early retirement initiatives that were being tabled had to be changed. There was also a closing or proposed closing of certain inefficient projects that were being done by government. So those are going to be scrutinized and looked at quite carefully. Also things like identifying ghost workers and inefficiencies in the payroll. Those are all kind of spending issues that were being looked at in order to change the budget and allow for that deficit that was being, I use the term deficit, but effectively the shortfall that was being created as a result of not influencing or introducing a VAT rate hike. Now, which implies, because VAT is a form of taxation, it implies that the tax changes then had to be looked at, or the tax side of the budget had to be looked at in terms of providing that revenue to compensate for not having a VAT hike or a VAT increase. Yeah. So what was looked at was that in order to subtly increase the revenue that was going to be collected, or that's going to be collected, the personal income tax brackets were not adjusted. reason for this is because if you earn a higher salary and the tax bracket doesn't change, you automatically land up in a higher tax bracket, which means more revenue is collected. So it's a subtle way of increasing tax revenue collection. I think the other thing that is also being done is that changes to medical aid credits were not made. So normally, if you do contribute to a medical aid, you get a form of rebate in the terms of a credit on your medical contributions, and this is normally adjusted by inflation on an annual basis, but this time around it was not adjusted, so which also means that you get less of a credit for contributing to a medical aid, which means that the revenue side of the budget then, or the revenue side in terms of collection, can increase as well. And then also what has happened in this latest budget, there's been an increase in the fuel levy, or the fuel levies increase is going to take effect, which is also another way of taxing and also increasing the revenue side of the budget. Collectively, all of these things then gives the revenue side a bit of a boost and also mitigates the shortfall that was created by not taking or not initiating a VAT hike. Now, reading through the budget, I also see that the South African Revenue Service has been given a bit of a leg up or foot up in terms of extra resources, which they will use to upskill and increase their operational capability, which means they'll have the ability to also then increase their capacity to collect the revenue more efficiently and to collect more revenue, which in turn effectively helps with the overall growth within the economy, because then it provides the Treasury with the means to be able to do what is ever necessary, especially in terms of the infrastructure plans and initiatives that they have in place. What this also meant was the way in which this budget was done is that there was not a big need, and especially this is a series on all things fixed income, for the government to borrow as much as they thought they would initially, or as much as they thought they needed to borrow. So this time around, they reconfigured the budget so that they didn't have to borrow as much or actually increase their borrowing, especially on the bond side. I think maybe in the outer years, 2-3 years down the line, there will have to be increased borrowing, but this time around, they managed to keep the borrowing the same. They didn't need to increase the amount of borrowing that needs to happen, which effectively is good news for our bond markets. So in summary, I think this ballot that was produced was a little bit more palatable to all parties involved, whether it's political or financial. I think it remains to be seen whether it will be growth supportive, but I sincerely hope that is the case. And it also should lead to improving what is known as our fiscal consolidation. In other words, our fiscal metrics such as the measurement of our debt relative to GDP and the like should improve as a result of the way in which this budget has been configured. So if everything works out the way that is anticipated, we should see this budget then being a lot more palatable to everybody involved and even being a bit mildly positive to our financial markets. So that's me. I take on the budget that's just been delivered. I'm Sidney McKinnon, CIO and MD of Cadiz Asset Management.